Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Holistic Hub podcast. Thank you for joining us today. I am joined today by Dr. Josh Helman. I'm really excited because today's topic is going to be all about how to battle daily toxic exposures and what we can do to support our body's natural ability to detoxify on a regular basis. So thank you, Dr. Josh, for joining me today. And I would love for you to just briefly introduce yourself and then we'll get started.
Great. No, thanks for having me, Dr. Stephanie. Yeah, it's, again, my name is Dr. Josh Helman, 2 degrees in biochemistry, 2 degrees from Harvard. I started off in emergency medicine, and my focus now is preventing and reversing disease, specifically Alzheimer's, but other chronic diseases too. So, and we met a few years ago at a fasting center. So, yeah, no, this is amazing.
Oh, I know. It's always so great. Like, you never know who it is that you'll come across and then what type of collaborations you end up doing later on. Because just earlier last year, we both spoke at the Veg Fest here in Southern California, and that
Right.
was so much fun. So it's really
Yeah.
cool to just be able to, collaborate again. So thank you. Yes, thank you for joining and for that great intro. So I think this is a really great way to just start with, since you mentioned that you are working with a lot of, longevity and preventing and reversing different types of chronic diseases, including Alzheimer's. I mean, I could imagine that environmental chemicals and toxins and pollutants, right? Those are a big piece to it. So, or at least play a part in it. So if you could maybe briefly describe what, we'll just lay the groundwork. What are environmental toxins and maybe where are some common exposures that we do come across them?
Yeah, it's a fascinating field because there are actually so many in our modern society. Anything from heavy metals to forever chemicals to other petrochemicals to mold toxins to and where do we get exposed to them? They're in the air, they're in our clothes, they're in our food, and the scary part is often these exposures are not recent. They're from 10, 20, 30 years ago. And and it's super complicated, and me being the biochemistry nerd, I get excited by it, and especially now that I understand that these toxins will prematurely age you and make it more likely that you get some of these chronic diseases. So, yeah, these are not theoretical problems. And, in the emergency room, often I would face acute exposure, acute heavy metal or medication overdose or carbon monoxide, poisoning. But the issue is, even if it's not a huge, massive, acute exposure, it can still be a problem. And but connecting the dots and knowing what to do and without getting super frustrated and just saying this is too difficult. I think that's the important thing, is just first to get people's attention. Like, yeah, this is something we should all be looking at.
Definitely. And I love how you mentioned that when you were working in the emergency room that you dealt with a lot of acute exposures. And that's something I would love to dive into because I think what makes it hard to make that connection for a lot of people between symptoms that they're having that have developed over the years and what they may be exposed to daily is the fact that it's not these crazy acute, like large exposures that people are getting, but it's actually chronic low dose exposures that's really just building up in our bodies over time. Would you agree with that? And that's what's kind of developing. I mean, obviously in certain cases, there's obviously going to be those acute exposures, but a lot of it is those chronic low dose exposures over time.
I would agree. And also in the emergency room, you can see people with toxicity from chronic exposure, not necessarily huge dose, but moderate dose, but over time. And, the classic of this is, Tylenol overdose. You don't want to take a large amount of acetaminophen or Tylenol all at once. And you also don't want to be taking large amounts chronically either. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And you also touched on another point too. It's something that I bring up with my clients a lot is the places I always like to kind of look at when I'm working with people, at least just to start, because there's, like you said, there is a lot of places that you could start in thinking about and reducing your exposure. But is like, okay, the food that we're eating, where is it? Is it sprayed with pesticides? What's the packaging that it's coming in? And then the water that we're drinking, and then the air that we're breathing, right? Those are some really big areas that, are very, very common to get exposed to and are important to look at. All areas are important to look at, but again, those are areas that we're probably coming into contact with a lot of things. So, in terms of, I guess, what are some of the more common exposures that you see on a daily basis, what would you say are maybe your top 3 to 5 that you would recommend somebody just to start right now and maybe bringing more awareness to, and then maybe starting to reduce exposure?
Yeah, I think a great place to start is the water that people drink, because what I was taught growing up, and I know many people are still hearing this, is that, oh, tap water is perfectly safe. That basically any water is safe. Don't worry about it. And my experience is that's just not true. And I bring that up because I see many hydrocarbons, petrochemicals like PERC, that trying to figure out how did this patient get exposed to such high levels of this complicated fatty molecule. And normally we trace it back to contamination of the groundwater. So that's why I'm a big fan of starting with a clean water source.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
that's a big one.
yeah, and I'll give you another example where uh, people say, "Oh, the public water is safe." Well, let me give you an example. The very last step that the municipal water facilities will use to clean out all the particulate matter in the water, like the leaves and other stuff, is they'll add in aluminum in order to bind up and get rid of those particulate. And it's great. Yeah, you don't necessarily want leaves in your water, but the problem or the issue is by adding in all this aluminum, we now know that aluminum leads to dementia, it leads to cancer, etc. It's not something that you want large amounts on a daily basis.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And again, with the water supply, that is so big because we're ideally drinking half our body weight in ounces of water a day. So we're coming into a lot of contact with water. So it's good to make sure that our water is filtered, and not even on that filtered level, but making sure what it is that we're drinking our water out of. So do you have any tips or recommendations too for what it is that because a lot of people are using those single plastic use water bottles that they buy at the store, and they say they're filtered, with the clean spring water
Yeah,
from whichever source. And
yeah,
it sounds all good and everything,
yeah,
but it's usually
yeah.
not.
So for the first step is I basically want distilled or reverse osmosis, because that way I know there's nothing in the water, or there should be nothing in the water. So that's number one. Number two, I would say stay away from plastics, including drinking water out of plastic, because unfortunately some of the plastic will leach out into the water you drink, and you'll have these microparticles of plastics. And we've done studies now. These microplastics, some of them are endocrine disruptors, meaning they will cause haywire with the hormone systems in your body. And to me, it's scary, but it's also it's difficult. Let's just be upfront, because plastic is in almost everything in modern society now. So instead of plastic, I recommend things like drink out of glass, drink out of steel, ceramic. There are other safer options.
Yeah. And on that topic of plastic, um, specifically honing in on BPA, right, as a major component of that piece, I believe that BPA, so bisphenol A, was originally used as synthetic estrogen, but was later found to be able to harden plastic. So
True.
again, but you're mentioning that hormone disrupting piece. That's if we're drinking water that's constantly coming into contamination with that plastic and going into our body, it can imagine the level of hormone disruption that's occurring, right? Especially too, if we're heating our foods in plastic in the microwave, or we are or a single-use plastic water bottle was sitting in the car on a hot day, like that heat also leaches chemicals too into the water, right? So, I mean, there's multiple ways that you can get exposed to that piece, but also BPA is only one of, I believe, 30 or 40 different types of bisphenols, right? And is it a common, do you know this? Is it a common marketing scheme or tactic to state that it is BPA free, but still contains other form of bisphenols?
Yeah, I see that unfortunately very commonly. It's used, like you said, it's a marketing tactic where, let's say they use bisphenol F and not A. They'll say, hey, this is BPA free, and not mention that there's BPF in it, which is just as toxic, if not more toxic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. Yep. I always tell people to look into that piece and be careful, because if they're saying BPA free and we're seeing we're still
Right.
seeing plastic, well, there's something else that they're using, right? In form of bisphenol that, like you said, is just as toxic, if not more, than actual BPA itself, which can be a little bit scary.
Right. And another issue here is you may look at a water bottle or the water and say, oh, I don't see any plastics, dissolved in the water. The whole point is it's microscopic. You're not going to see it, but it's the microscopic ones that are some pieces that are the most scary, because once you drink it, it can go anywhere in your body, including into your gut and then into your bloodstream, into your lymphatics, and then throughout the tissues in the body. And they've done studies recently on human placentas, and 100% of human placentas had microplastics embedded inside of them. So presumably, it's not just the placenta; it's also the newborn baby too. So it's scary, and I think it's having biologic effects. And historically, I don't know, 10, 20 years ago, there's certain numbers on the bottom of plastic bottles you should look for, like, oh yeah, number one is, like, I don't even remember the numbers, but the bottom line is none of the numbers are safe, because it's not just the specific type of plastic, it's also the accelerants and additives that are combined in the manufacture process. So unfortunately, the safest thing to do is to stay away from plastic when it has to do with anything you're going to eat or drink touching your food.
Wow. On that topic of plastics, while we're still talking about plastics, maybe we can hone in on another environmental chemical that does tend to get used also in plastic use, as phthalates. And depending on the molecular weight of phthalates, they can either be used to make plastic more flexible, or they're also used in products to bind scents. So that way that they have this nice smelling flowery scent, but in turn is actually also causing similar disruptions in our body like BPA is. So could you talk a little bit more about phthalates and maybe where we can find them, and maybe some of the the effects that they have on our body?
Yeah, so unfortunately, these phthalates, you're exactly right. They are added to plastics to make them softer. Which, sure, who doesn't want? Sometimes you want plastics not to crack and be soft and pliable. The problem or the issue is that the phthalates ultimately get into us, and they're endocrine disruptors, meaning they'll cause a lot more estrogen than you want, or block estrogen receptors when you don't want them to, as examples. So, and you can look. I mean, they're on bottles. Sometimes they'll say phthalate free, which is great when I see that, but that's not the equivalent of saying phthalate 3 and doesn't contain any other toxic chemicals in the manufacture. So, to my mind, phthalates are important to avoid. You can measure phthalate levels in patients, and yeah. So I think it's just yet another reason to try to stay away from plastics.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, it does make it more convenient when they are more soft and, pliable and easy to use. But again, that usually means that probably the level of toxic exposure you're getting from that is a little bit higher than if it was hardened. The other question I have too regarding phthalates, since we're on this topic now, is twofold. Well, one, I see a lot of exposures still coming from candle use or air fresheners or those wall plugins. And oftentimes I tell people that an easy and free way to just reduce your exposure is just throwing those out because they're not adding any benefit, correct? So do you see a lot of that use still getting used today?
Unfortunately, I do, and I look on the ingredients, and they're toxic chemicals, carcinogens in these products, but the general public assumes, hey, this is for sale, therefore it must be safe, and it's not. And you're exactly right. There are other things that you can use if you want to add, you know, make the air smell better. I mean, I like just using pure essential oils, diffusing those. Now those may be a lot more expensive than the $1 or $2 plug-in you're going to buy, but even candles, petroleum based candles, are not safe. So, but there's a huge disconnect. I mean, the health club I work at, and I said, hey, would you mind not using these plugins because I don't want to be breathing this stuff. And oh yeah, by the way, when you clean down the equipment, do you mind using a cleaner that's not toxic? And unfortunately, there's I can just tell you, there's not a general recognition. The fear is, I don't want to get an infectious disease. But what people don't realize, great, you've cleaned down all this equipment, but and you're not going to get spread infection, but you are getting the bad chemicals that are, not only do these chemicals kill the bacteria on the equipment, they also potentially will kill the bacteria in your own gut that are good bacteria.
Oh, that is such a great point. I was hoping we'd get to this in the conversation, is maybe talking a little bit about some of these environmental chemicals that we know can actually disrupt our gut too. And like you mentioned, yeah, if we're seeing these antibacterial materials that are getting used on these in our environment, imagine if it's killing everything off there, imagine what it's doing to us on the inside, correct? So I actually have seen some studies they were on rats, but it was with BPA as well as phthalates affecting our gut. What other chemicals, such as maybe even pesticides, like that's a big one that can disrupt our gut? What are some other ones that you would recommend people starting to become more aware of that can really mess with our gut microbiome?
Yeah, so in terms of the microbiome, the bugs that live inside our gut, I would include the whole concept of trying to eat organic, because many of the pesticides that like Roundup or glyphosate, they work by killing bugs and killing pests. And unfortunately, if you're eating food that's loaded with this Roundup or similar chemicals, it's like you're taking antibiotics, which in turn are destroying the healthy bacteria in your gut.
I think I saw this statistic once that said there is 1 billion pound of pesticides that are sprayed. I believe it's in the US every year, which is just an alarming number of the amount that's getting contaminated within our food. And it's not even just in the food, just even bringing it back to the water, right? With the runoff, it's getting into the water supply. And then that's in turn, if we're not filtering our water, then also contaminating us because it's getting into the water that we are drinking as well. So yeah, eating organic, absolutely, I consider to be one of the biggest changes that somebody can make when they're starting to swap over to kind of living a little bit more of a toxin-free lifestyle, right?
I agree, and yeah, I mean, there's Roundup now in the rainwater, and yeah, that's what's going on. It's being used so much by industry, and it doesn't get broken down; it just gets recycled into bodies of water.
I'm curious, what are some of the, I know we've already touched on a few different things that you've even seen clinically that environmental chemicals can lead to in terms of symptoms and conditions. What are some other common ones that people, so if somebody is listening today and just wondering, oh, I wonder if maybe because I've been exposing myself to X, Y, and Z for the last 20 years, this could be a big reason why this has contributed to my current lifestyle disease. Are there any other ones or other symptoms that you see as more common?
Yeah, I would say in general terms, I think one of the reasons why we see the explosion of obesity, people who are obese and overweight are now 2/3 of Americans, and it certainly wasn't that way 50 or 80 years ago. One of the huge reasons is increased exposure to these chemicals at an extremely early age, basically before people are born now. They're, these endocrine disruptors have been found in umbilical cord blood, measured right after birth. So, and with obesity and being overweight comes lots of other chronic diseases, whether it's high blood pressure, diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, you name it. So these chemicals are real, but I don't want people to be overwhelmed with this whole concept. I mean, it is disturbing, but I would say one step at a time. I mean, another large exposure, unfortunately, is clothing. The majority of clothing is plastic based, and if you've got clothes next to your body, all day long, you could definitely absorb some of the chemicals in your clothes.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, kind of going back to what you were mentioning about about obesity being kind of that end result of the exposure to a lot of these endocrine disrupting chemicals. I've heard the term obesogenic chemicals. Like there's a list of them that have been linked now to affecting our like fat development in us, as well as affecting our hormones that can create potentially, I believe, larger fat cells or something like that. I read it in this book that was specifically talking about obesogenic chemicals, and BPA, phthalates, and pesticides are all considered obesogenic chemicals as well. So yeah, it's
Right.
scary. And again, we don't want to be scaring the population about all these different chemicals that are out there, but it is good to just take these small steps. And I think focusing on the foods that you're eating, right? If they're organic is really important. Focusing on filtering your water and then what you're drinking your water out of, I think are three really great steps that somebody can take to starting to reduce their exposure.
Right, and I would say, I would add, start looking at ingredients. If there's an ingredient you don't recognize, it's probably not good for you. Something that's, you know, 30 letters long, and yeah. And here's the other thing: is that at least in the United States, um, there we don't seem to follow the precautionary principle. Like we basically assume that a chemical is going to be safe unless it's been proven to have a problem, as opposed to, hey, this is a new chemical. Let's be very careful before we release this on the public.
Yes, I think that if we see it on the shelves, it's presumed safe, correct?
Right.
And that's, yes, and that is another scary concept because a lot of products that are unfortunately on the shelf are not. And so it's good, like you said, to make sure that you can at least just start getting used to reading the ingredient label. And there's even apps now that help to check these different ingredients that you can use to reduce your exposure to some of these chemicals and help. And one of the apps that I actually like is called, I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's called Clearya. And it's
I like
really,
that one.
yeah, that's a really, really great one. Do you have other apps that you like or other ways of cross-checking?
I normally just check with the environmental working group, ewg.org.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
We haven't even touched on the air quality piece. You
Right.
had mentioned that, but is one of kind of the top three areas that we get exposed because
Yeah.
we breathe like 11,000 liters of air a day. But having good quality air inside the house is important because I think the EPA has estimated that the indoor air can be 3 to 5 times more toxic than outdoor air. So, right. So that's probably a big one. Do you have any tips on air quality in the home?
Sure. I mean, most people spend more time indoors than outdoors, and I would recommend getting an air filter, whether it's a HEPA filter or something like that, and using it. Yeah, I love the idea of opening up windows if you know the air quality is good outside, depending on where you are. And yeah,
Yeah.
again, I don't want people to be overwhelmed, but it turns out that a lot of the so-called modern uh, um, finishes that are or fake woods that are used in construction now off gas. So this is a real problem. The the one of the better types of construction material, linoleum. I mean, I don't like how it looks, but apparently you get much less off gassing and chemicals from linoleum.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's a good tip,
yeah,
especially for someone that's trying to build a home or
yeah,
right because there's all kinds of materials that you can use and that could probably be overwhelming as well in terms of what to pick. So, yeah.
yeah,
Thank you for that. So, let's kind of now that we've kind of laid the groundwork for yeah, we do get exposed to different chemicals on a daily basis, all this stuff, and again, important to not get overwhelmed by any of this because that's what our bodies are for. Our bodies are made to be able to detoxify on a regular basis. I mean, we don't want to be coming into contact with too many chemicals, but so what would you say are a couple of your favorite ways to support detoxification on a regular basis?
yeah. So there are a lot of things you can do. One is eat foods that have fiber in it, whether it's fruits, vegetables, or whole grains. It turns out that the fiber piece is going to help move some of those toxins out of your body. So that's, you know, choosing foods that you eat. The next for support, I would look at binding agents, whether in addition to the fiber in your food, whether that's things like zeolite or activated charcoal, things that will actually bind. And my tip is, take it right before you go to sleep, because if you take other supplements, you don't want to bind up those other supplements.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. And I love that you mentioned the fiber piece because yes, that is a great way to support regular detoxification is fiber actually binding onto toxins and not even that, but just I guess even eating a diverse amount of fruits and vegetables, right? Because those will give us nutrients to help aid in supporting our liver and our even our gut and just giving us the necessary B vitamins and all these things that we need to, right, to support our body to detoxify, right?
right. And I mean, there's several supplements that I like. Things like, or other supplements like glutathione or N-acetylcysteine. I'm a fan of because glutathione is the master detoxifier at the level of your cells. So, eating the food that's highest in glutathione turns out to be raw asparagus. But if you're not a fan of raw asparagus, that's okay. You can there's a supplement called N-acetylcysteine that can help raise levels of glutathione, and then there are also sprays that can help because I find unfortunately many of my patients have inability to absorb nutrients or supplements that we offer, and for that reason, the spray is better because it'll be absorbed at the level of the mouth before trying to get it to the gut.
Oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And with glutathione, that is so interesting. I didn't know that raw asparagus was the highest concentration of glutathione that you could get through food. I did know that there are other sources of it as well. I believe okra and I think even avocado I had um,
Yeah.
seen somewhere that were higher sources also of glutathione as well. So it's good to know that we can at least get it through our food too.
Definitely, but again, that relies on the ability of your gut to absorb that nutrient. And I found some of the sickest patients, unfortunately, they had black mold trichothecene toxin actually embedded in their gut, preventing the absorption of these nutrients. So yeah, I love glutathione spray. Another category that I think is important is nitric oxide supplements and or getting it in your food, leafy greens, but there are also supplements that will help increase nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a gas. It's just one nitrogen and one oxygen atom stuck together. It will open up blood vessels. And if we can open up blood vessels, including to your heart and your gut and your lungs and other organs, it's going to be a lot easier for your body to detoxify it. Connected with nitric oxide, I like to take it right before I work out because I have a much better workout. And it turns out just by exercising, you're sweating, and the fact that you sweat, many of these toxins get released in the sweat.
So with the nitric oxide supplement, I'm assuming not all nitric oxide supplements are made the same. Is there one that you recommend or a couple brands that you like for it?
Yeah, I mean, my favorite one is Cardio Miracle, which has like 53 different ingredients, but it's organic. It's set up specifically in order to increase the production of nitric oxide both in your mouth and your gut. So it's a powder that you mix in water. I recommend swishing it before you swallow. That way, you get good production of nitric oxide in your mouth and your gut. If I like it because it lasts, at least 24 hours, as opposed to you choose some leafy greens. It's great, but it's only going to boost the nitric oxide production for like 4 hours. So it's something, but I mean, I like doing both.
Yeah, absolutely. Through the food and through supplement. I love it.
Yeah.
And then, so you mentioned sweating. So yeah, absolutely. Sweating is a great way to release toxins that we are coming into contact with. So maybe we can shift the chat over to talking about sauna therapy because
Okay.
I know that you're a fan of sauna therapy. I am too. So maybe we can talk about the benefits of it and the differences between infrared versus traditional saunas.
Right. I mean, the traditional just using steam, it works. I mean, the a lot of the studies done in Scandinavia were done using traditional steam saunas. And, in terms of how long to go there, I would say start low. I would start with a little bit of time and a lower temperature, and then work your way up. And infrared uses this radiation, this heat, basically heats you up from the inside out. So it's a slightly different mechanism, but both ways you sweat. And to my mind, the most important thing is that you actually sweat.
Mm-hmm. Would you say then that somebody who probably tries to work up a sweat but has an inability to be able to do that would then show you that that person's under a bit of a toxic load with that piece? Because I find that with a lot of my clients.
Definitely, and it's hard to know which came first, right? Is it they're toxic because they can't sweat, and so they're building up all these toxins over months and years. But yeah, I've definitely seen an association like you have.
With using sauna therapy, how often do you recommend somebody use it? Let's say it's their main form of sweating. They're not doing cardio workout or anything. They're using saunas maybe to just work up a sweat. So how often times per week and how many minutes a day would you say is like a kind of a sweet spot?
Yeah, I mean, the more the studies show, the more is better. So if you can do it every single day, that's awesome. But if you can't, that's okay too. The same thing. I wouldn't start with 30 minutes. Start with 5 minutes and build your way up. I mean, that's how I found it. Is that the first time I could only stay in for a few minutes, and whereas the people who do sauna every single day, they were there for 20 minutes. So it's not a contest against other people. It's a contest for yourself, and you never should be doing it if you feel weak or tired from this.
Yeah, absolutely. I even noticed with my infrared sauna that when I first started using it, I started between like 5 to 7 minutes and I noticed benefits with it already. Like I felt great. And I didn't feel like it was a placebo effect, but I just remember feeling like, wow, I really could feel like better and more energized from it. And I barely even broke a sweat from it, but it was just a short amount of time, but it was just like, because of how it is heating you from the inside out, it felt like it was just healing at that cellular level that I felt benefit from it. So I always tell people the same thing when I'm working with clients and they're starting out, right? Especially for people that are really sensitive. We don't want to be jumping in at a 30-minute sauna therapy, but even just starting at a few minutes can really have a lot of benefits. And I like that you mentioned that.
Right, and the mechanism biochemically is there are something called heat shock proteins that you stimulate when you go into a warm or hot environment, and those trigger some of the anti-aging pathways that you come away feeling really good.
Yeah,
Listen to your body. Yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely. Another topic I wanted to touch on really quick was those PEMF mats
sure.
and red light. I think that'd be a really great way to turn, because I think that's starting to become more popular now in terms of supporting just our regular detoxification capacities and things like that. So can you touch on the benefits of using those PMF mats and then the red light therapy?
Yeah, both of them I'm fans of because they help open up the microcirculation, which means the smallest of the small blood vessels called capillaries, and also the lymphatic system, which we now know travels to the brain. We didn't think it was the brain had a lymphatic system, when I was in training 30 years ago, but now we know that the lymphatics go all the way up to the brain. So yeah, so I'm a fan of this pulse electrical magnetic therapy, and then also the red light therapy, because it helps clean out and optimize the microcirculation. Because if your microcirculation, the smallest blood and lymphatic vessels, if they're open, your body has a much better chance of trying to move some of these toxins out. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And I personally have one. I just got it a few months ago, and I've already noticed benefits with it too. So I swear it's not placebo, but I do feel really good after I use it. So, that's really interesting to hear. Absolutely. One final question for you
Sure.
about detoxing is fasting. Since I just want to circle back to that, since we
Sure.
both worked at True North Health Center, which is a world
Yep.
renowned water fasting center. Can you talk about the benefits of fasting, and it can even be water fasting, it could be the 5-day fasting mimicking diet, or even juice fasting. What do you find?
Yeah. So I find fasting definitely helps remove toxins for a few reasons. One is when you're fasting, you're not taking in hopefully any toxins in terms of food, but also when you're fasting, you're resting your gut so that your body can then put its energy into um, revitalizing and recycling um, proteins and other molecules in your body that are misshaped and misformed. It's basically your body's like, oh, I can do housekeeping now. I can basically fix the scaffolding that 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 we're normally based on, because I don't have to worry about the normal huge metabolic demands of digesting food.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
No, I'm such a big proponent of fasting, and I love that there are different methods for being able to get into that autophagy state, where that's that cellular rejuvenation state, right? It doesn't have to be, a strict water fast. Now there's the prolonged 5-day fasting mimicking diet that's actually mimicking fasting in our body. We're eating about 600 to 800 calories a day, which is helpful for some. That true water fasting just is very, very hard to do. And then same thing with juice fasting as well. So thank you for sharing that.
sure. And we know that biochemically, the changes that happen when you fast are almost identical to when you exercise. And we know when you exercise, you're also, you're sweating up a storm and removing some of the toxins that way. So, and both with exercise and with fasting, don't feel like you're competing with other people. You're competing with yourself. So if you've never fasted before, don't go through a huge fast. Just maybe skip breakfast or lunch, a couple days and see how it goes. Same thing with exercise. If you're not exercising at all, yeah, try a little. Try walking around the block to start with.
I love that. I love that you keep circling back to saying that it's not a competition with other people, it's with yourself, because that's absolutely true. We are all made differently. We're all exposed to different things at different times, and we're all at different places in our life, right? And so what we need to be focusing on is ourselves and not what other people are doing that may be working for them in that moment and in that time, right? So
Definitely. Yeah.
thank you. I feel like that was a really great note to end on. So is there any other tips or suggestions or anything that you wanted to leave the audience with today?
Gosh, I mean, we could literally talk for many hours on some of these topics. What I would say is just come to my website, drjosh.com, drjosh.com. I have more information on toxins and how to remove them. And I would just circle back and say, don't be overwhelmed. I was saddened to learn this, years ago, and but the exciting thing is the more people we get to understand this, the more pressure there's going to be on improved products out there that are not toxic.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you again for joining me today. And I will have all the links for everything you talked about in the show notes, in your bio, and where people can find you. So thank you, Josh, for joining me today.
Thanks, Stephanie. This was a lot of fun.
Yes, it was. Thank you.
Awesome.